All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight. Some of you today, some of you tonight. My name is Sarah, and I'm joining you today from Toronto, or as known today as Toronto, the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is the treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited to come into this treaty, or have come into this treaty with the responsibility to uphold the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. The dish, or sometimes referred to as the bowl, represents what is now southern Ontario, from the Great Lakes to Quebec, and from Lake Simcoe into the United States. The idea of the dish is that we all eat out of this one dish with one spoon, showing that we all have the responsibility to share the resources and to take good care of the land and the creatures that we shared with. And importantly, there's no knives at this table, representing that we must keep the peace. As a planetary scientist and educational developer, my responsibility towards the Indigenous people is to learn more about Indigenous science, Indigenous knowledge, and make room for it. Tonight, we're all joining virtually from different places all across the world, and I welcome you to take a minute to reflect and see whose land you're on, and to learn more about the land that you're on. Tonight's guest speaker is Divya Persaud. She's a planetary scientist, writer, and composer. Divya's research has spanned mission development and operations, the surfaces of interiors of Mercury, Mars, icy moons of Saturn, meteorites and asteroids, to understand where they come from. So basically, I guess any planetary science questions that you have, from any moons to planets to meteorites, Divya is the person to go to. She's currently pursuing her Ph.D. at the University College London's Mullard Space Science Laboratory, where she's applying 3D imaging to understand the landing site of the Curiosity rover. She has spoken and performed her equity and artistic internationally, with awards in both outreach and poetry. She's passionate about bridging the spheres of science, engagement, activism, and arts. So with that, welcome, Divya. And we're just going to transfer host duties so that Divya can share her screen with you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you so much for having me. So today I'm going to talk to you about organizing access-centered and interdisciplinary conferences, and this is a pretty broad topic. And to start and address the question of why I'm talking about conferences, so I am a planetary scientist, and as Sarah discussed, I work as a planetary geologist at the nexus of image processing, 3D visualization for both science and outreach, and geology at Mullard Space Science Laboratory. But I'm also chronically ill, and I'm really passionate about science communication. And all of this work, so conveying meaning with images, for example, discussing with kids about abstract concepts about space, and just being a student in a vibrant environment in combination with my condition, I think about access a lot and what access means. And access is a bit of a nebulous term, and I'm going to get into what it means. I also speak a lot and have a few collaborations about the ways we conceive of space, ownership, ethics, colonialism, and this has turned into, in the past about just a year, into event organizing. So interdisciplinary equitable science and dissemination, in my point of view, are really, really vital to ensuring that our field in planetary science and beyond can be democratic and on the right side of history. So on the right, I have an image of the land protectors at Mauna Kea, and they're holding a sign that says road closed due to desecration. So what does access mean? Access to me as a disabled person is really about everyone. So the social model of disability tells us that while our bodies may have differences or impairments, there is an act of disablement that is caused by socio-political forces. So for example, one might be disabled by there being a lack of infrastructure for wheelchairs to operate, getting onto and leaving sidewalks, for example. And so when we think about the social model of disability, which isn't necessarily true, but is certainly a theory that a lot of people have been discussing in the past 30 years or so, we also have to think about who else is disabled, really, socially, politically, medically. All of us, and especially marginalized people, are disabled in many different ways. So one might be disabled in an intellectual way. They might be disabled in the way that they're excluded. They might be disabled from voting or participation in democracy. So, and part of this is thinking about who is prevented from accessing knowledge. And this itself is a huge, huge concept of when we think of who has access to, say, education in the US, or who has access to quality information about how their bodies work. And then when we think about academia, it's who is there and who isn't there and why. And we can think of this, so there's this term epistemic violence, which is the issue of people not being able to access information that they have a right to. So again, for example, knowledge of one's own health, and that information being locked away in the ivory tower. So how can we subvert this in how we organize meetings? So this might feel like a huge jump from going from these theoretical frameworks of understanding dispossession in our societies to academic conferencing. But it's an important question because conferences are where we disseminate information, right? Conferences play an important role in building our resumes and growing networks and learning about the status of one's field. It's where we build a lot of communities. It's where we start collaborations or really pick up a lot of information. And I, as someone who absolutely loves conferences, I love going into random rooms and not looking at the program and just absorbing information. Have really appreciated how exclusionary conferences can be. So I was looking for citations for some of these comments, and there's just so much study on what happens at conferences in terms of exclusion, particularly sexual harassment, racial harassment, ableist harassment, where you just have groups of people and societies or organizations may not have very clear codes of conduct or enforce them in progressive ways. And this tends to fall on the shoulders of people who are already being excluded in academia. It tends to be women, it tends to be minorities, it tends to be disabled people and queer people. And the infrastructure that supports this behavior is also really important, where academia is already exclusive, as I mentioned. So, we have universities that have exclusive admissions policies, who host events, who may not necessarily be invested in taking care of the needs of the people that they're excluding already. And a lot of conferences are sort of built in this way of, treating, for example, scientists as intelligent adults who should be responsible for their own actions, but may not be producing an environment that is conducive to equitable interactions between people. And that's really, really important, that just because we have a room full of intelligent people, it doesn't mean that problems aren't going to arise, and they shouldn't be self-regulating in that way. And there's also, of course, the existing debate around alcohol culture, especially I'm a geologist. It's a really big issue in geology and geology conferences. If you've ever been to AGU or EGU, where it can be exclusive of people with addictions and also from different religious backgrounds. For example, I don't drink, so I just don't network at conferences. So coming from that experience of really, really loving conferences, but also pretty much not attending them in the way I'd like to. Being chronically ill, I usually take a day off in the middle of a week. I have to arrive somewhere early. I have to leave there probably a day late because I need to recover from the expenditure of energy to get there. And then on top of that, I avoid people who I know are harassers. And then, there isn't physical infrastructure, for example, enough chairs to support me um, needing to sit after a lot of activity or to sit at networking events where usually people are standing and drinking. Um, so over the past few years, I've been thinking about how do we make conferences better and how does that relate to who we see at conferences, who we see getting invited to speak at conferences and build the collaborations that we should be building. So there's this really, really landmark book that just came out. It's free. It's through UCL. It's called Ableism in Academia. I recommend it to anyone. I got really lost in it today. And there was this excellent paragraph on the experiences of disabled people at conferences. So for example, when we took a flight of stairs, when we look at flights of stairs at conference venues, we have to think about and really assess what will the physical cost be of climbing these stairs in terms of pain and how will it affect the quality of what I have to do next. So if I'm in pain, am I going to be paying attention to the talk that I'm watching? What would the energetic costs be of climbing these stairs? How will it affect the quantity of other things I can do today? Will I have to go home early? Will I have to lie down? Will that mean the rest of the week I will just not have the energy to do what I want to do? Time, will it make me late to locate and wait for the lift if there is one? What will I miss? Will I be late and cause a disturbance? If I need to travel to a venue, how much longer will the journey take if I only use step-free stations? What will the time cost be of climbing or not climbing these stairs? So these are really explicit examples of the types of calculations that someone with mobility disabilities might be concerned with when thinking about a conference venue that doesn't have elevators. And so many conference venues do not have elevators, or they're in the back, or they're freight elevators, and they're hard to get to or use. But it can also be thought of as a metaphor for a lot of other things. If you have to think about your harasser being in a room, or you have to think about what will the energetic cost be of being in a room of just white people, or what will it what will it cost me to just sort of swallow the comments that I hear from other people? So we can think about these ways that we have to assess how we are disabled and what could enable us, right? And here's another example. Issues such as travel, fatigue, and the accessibility of rooms and buildings can inhibit attendance. And remote attendance is often either discouraged or looked on negatively as a sign of lack of commitment. In-house conferences do not always factor in accessibility considerations with a centralized checklist. And this is so true. And so nowhere in this presentation do I mention coronavirus, and that's really, really deliberate because I want us to imagine sort of beyond COVID of thinking about remote conferencing and our relationships to it. And I'll talk about that in a bit. Juani is wonderful and gave this great talk last month, and she talked about reclaiming science, and she gave this list. So this is pulled from her slide. It's on YouTube. A non-cooperative model of science cannot be good for society, which is such a concise way of putting it. And an exclusive model of science cannot be cooperative. It is inherently non-democratic, right? And lack of equity, diversity, inclusion are symptoms of that broken model. We need to humanize the model of science and technology, and we need to politicize science. And she's talking much more broadly in science, but then she actually moves on to conferences. How can we reclaim science for the people? We have been deprived from communities. So talking from the LGBTQ perspective of racial minorities, of disabled people, networking occurs in conferences. Conferences can be competitive, dehumanizing, exclusionary spaces. And we know the culture of inequity, competition, individualism, and very often harassment, and focus on productivity. We have no space left to discuss issues of scientists as a community. And she also talks about how oftentimes at a conference, you sort of get a women's corner, which I thought was a really great way of putting it. She says there's a geographic sort of point of meeting at conferences where the very few women who are in attendance will kind of group together. And I thought that was such a great metaphor of, how do we expand that bubble, of course, of not just women, but everyone else who is excluded from these spaces, to have that kind of community that we really need to discuss these issues. So to be a bit of a nerd, I'm using the moon Enceladus as a metaphor of better conferencing. So what can Access mean at a science conference? And let's think of it like Enceladus. If you don't know about Enceladus, that's fine. It's a very little, very exciting moon of Saturn that is covered in ice and has a subsurface ocean. And this diagram right here shows that essentially different features in the interior of this moon. So you have heat in the center of the moon. It's driving convection, which creates hot spots in the sea floor. And then there's transport of heat and rocky material through the ocean. And then you have localized heating at the contact of the water and the ice shell, which leads to thinning of the ice. And then you have pressure release, which causes jets. So that's a model of how we think Enceladus produces these really exciting water jets. And I really love this as a way to think of conferencing, because then you also have the cycle back of, you have the cold water coming back down into the rocky core. So I like to think of the core as the needs of your speakers and attendees. And so you have that as the core of what's driving the organization of the meeting. So that has to be the first thing you think of and design around. And from there, you get the needs of the speakers and participants should be driving the infrastructure of your conference. So that includes where you're located, what kind of technology you have. So if it's remote, what kind of platform you're using, what kind of captioning services, whatever. How you're moderating and enforcing your code of conduct, how you are ensuring the safety of your speakers and participants per their needs. And then what that should be doing is driving in our subsurface ocean, a diverse and enabled attendance. And then from there, we should be getting new connections forged and solidarity built. So it doesn't matter what topic the conference is, it could be about icy moons, for example. But ideally from that core, eventually it should be really driving meaningful connections that are inclusive and that are safe for people. And then from there, we should have exploding. We have the immediate benefits to research networks and collaborations. We have the enrichment of people's careers who are otherwise neglected. And then the long-term impacts on the field are the jets. So those are the valuable things that we are sampling, and maybe signs of life. And then all of that should feed back iteratively to generate new networks and make effective meetings more effective. So getting new ideas from these networks and innovation from these new connections. So either that's the science that is growing, or it is the organization of meetings that is becoming richer and richer. So there is some really fantastic heritage of access-centered conferencing. There's no way I can give you an exhaustive list, but there's one that I attended in March 2018 at UCL called Ableism in Academia, which ended up producing the book that I cited earlier. And it was just incredible. I think I signed up the day before. It was just a huge room, and there were different options for seating. There were blankets, there were cushions, there was so much space for people in wheelchairs to move. There was disabled toilet access for attendees only. There was a quiet room that had different materials in it. You could leave anytime, you could just get up and leave. No one was going to judge you. There would be a BSL interpreter as a deafblind interpreter, and then a live captioning service because they were live streaming as well. And it's been the only conference that I could eat a lot of food at. There was so much free from food, and they could serve you if you didn't want to go stand in a buffet. It was amazing. Another example, so I've never attended a SPI meeting, but SPI's conference proceedings online are really, really great. They're really compliant with web content accessibility guidelines. So if you look at any of their proceedings, there's usually a video of the talk. It's fully closed captioned. It has a transcription. Figures have screen reader friendly text and interface. So it's a really good example of sort of the online component of conferences and dissemination of conference material. So Space Science in Context, which some of you might know about, was a conference that I proposed with my colleague, Dr. Ellie Armstrong from UCL Space and Technology Studies and at the Institute of Education. So what we were imagining, so Ellie studies narratives in space science with a focus on museums from a feminist and queer perspective. I hope I got that right. We met by chance and we thought, it's so great how we're two sides of the same coin of thinking about planetary science and ethics and diversity in our communities. So we wanted to have our dream conference of bringing these two sides together, of really forcing these people to talk to each other. And this was something we proposed this January, so pre-pandemic, and we picked our dream speakers and thought, we don't know if we'll get funding. And we intended it for these two communities as a wake-up call and to jumpstart really dynamic networks and collaborations. So we got awarded in March. We got awarded about a week before lockdown in the UK. And we, in our proposal, we focused on the inaccessibility of conferences and also the carbon footprint of astronomy, which is significant. But also we sold it as innovating in virtual conferencing, not really knowing what we were getting into. And it's still really funny to us because we wanted a super accessible meeting, but we wanted our dream speakers and we simply just wouldn't have enough money to pay for both. We thought, okay, you know, where could we sort of cut funds that wouldn't sacrifice the integrity of our meeting? And what we cut was having an in-person conference. And we said, if we do it virtually, we save on the cost of renting and food and whatever. And then we can actually pay people fairly and then actually really think about how to innovate in the access side of conferencing. So when we got funded, we were pretty excited because all of these conferences were suddenly saying, we don't know what we're going to do for the next year or the next few months at least. And so we had an opportunity, we had the money that was explicitly earmarked for us to figure out how to do a virtual conference. And what our true goals were throughout this organization were access as our grounding ethos, so that nice warm core of our icy moon, the event function depending on that access. And we wanted it to be a case study of several things, of virtual meetings, especially since I think a lot of people, especially in the Zoom era, think that, okay, if it's something is virtual, it's inherently accessible, but actually that you need to take additional measures and have to think about quite a range of access needs of your audience. Meaningful virtual meetings in an epoch of climate disaster. Also just really wanting to bridge very disparate disciplines of science, ethics, arts, activism. And then also reimagining very radically diversity inclusion as, again, part of our nice toasty core of our icy moon and less of our afterthought, and to see what that would look like. And as part of all of this, our code of conduct was central to the event. So again, if you think of the nice hot center of the icy moon as the needs, then the next layer is the adjustments to those needs, and that is the code of conduct. So we decided to go with a flipped classroom model for the cross-disciplinary challenges of our conference, because we were thinking of a single day conference bridging, again, very disparate fields that are very, very niche. And we wanted the lecture material, so to speak, to be available to our attendees ahead of time. And this is based on a lot of studies that show that, particularly with cross-disciplinary teaching, that students are able to integrate the ideas that they absorb better when they actually meet, and then also have the time to explore the material based on their own needs. So we hosted all of our talks and our e-posters on the website a week in advance. So we had 12 invited speakers who had videos, and then about 30 e-posters, which were pretty much in any format that speakers wanted. So that was just hosted on Google Drive and through our website. And the live event was actually very different. So that was for the synthesis of the information, not for the dissemination. So we had 3 sessions during which our invited speakers spoke on panels. So Ellie and I just acted as chairs, and we had a list of questions for each panel and just went through them and had a really dynamic conversation. And then people could ask questions and type in the chat. The e-posters were in these parallel sessions, and they were not presenting their work, but they were rather discussing it with people interested. So if you were at a poster session, you really wanted to be there and talk about the material. We wanted to emphasize that with posters because studies tend to show with different societies that women tend to take poster presentations more than speaking. And in this case, we only had invited speakers, but we still really wanted to emphasize the importance of the posters as part of the conference. And then the live event also had live captioning. And we also collected questions ahead of time. So we had forms. So if you had a question while you were watching something or reading something, you could just type it in and send it to us, and we collated these. And for the invited speakers, that informed the chair's prompts. And for the poster authors, they actually got a list ahead of time. So if there was any lag in conversation, they could talk about what people were interested in or had some confusion about. So here's a glance of our schedule. So we organized this between March and May, and the live event was May 14th. So you can see the parallel poster sessions were in the morning. So these were people, we had one Australian, Alice Gorman, who was very kind, who joined very late at night. And so these were organized by time zones, are split with the poster speakers. And then in the afternoon, we had the second slot. And then we had our 3 main sessions. And so for the posters, it was about 8 of us split up between these Microsoft Teams meetings as moderators. So our access guidelines were a bit difficult to write, but they're based on best practice for both conference presenting and web design. So at the time in say March or April, when we were putting together the website, there was not really that strong of an example of how to moderate or to guide virtual conference content or virtual conference behavior. And so that was something that we really had to innovate in and do our homework for. So for the media, meaning the speakers' videos, although we got paid transcription and closed caption for those, but for mostly the posters, we were very, very strict. We said it has to be screen reader friendly. If it's text, it has to be captioned if there's a video along with a transcript. Large clear text with sans serif fonts, high contrast colors, no reliance on colors to denote information. So for example, on this slide, font size denotes this heading and underlining denotes this URL. And we were very, very stringent on animations as well. And we made ourselves repeatedly available to offer additional adjustments for anyone who asked. So when we accepted our proposals for posters, we asked for proposals. We said, you know, if you have any needs, please let us know and we can talk to you. We can have a call, we can email about your content with speakers. The same thing, we emphasized repeatedly, if anything in your situation changes, if you realize that actually do need something, we're always here to help. And that was really, really important. So, and as I mentioned, the conference policy, we also had to innovate a bit with. So this was based on in-person events and Zoom disasters we had by that point heard about, including Zoom bombing. So we banned screenshotting or screen recording, which isn't really standard, but it was sort of based on the sensitive subject matter that people were discussing. So we were talking about equity, we were talking about people's lived experiences. So we didn't want our speakers to be concerned about their content being lifted or shared with anyone. And we banned spam in the chat windows or contact forms. And all those 2 things were zero tolerance, as well as zero tolerance for any harassment, bullying, and intimidation, which we defined quite in depth as well. So this was iterated at registration. This was iterated at every single level of emailing to remind about the event or to remind about the format of the event to both the audience as well as to speakers. And then during the event, it was restated at the beginning of every 20-minute poster slot. So in that little grid I showed you, every single rectangle, we repeated it. We typed it in the chat as well. And at the beginning of the main speaker sessions. So we really drove it home. We do not tolerate any of these things. You get one warning and then you're out for most of the things. So, and that resulted in, we had one warning for 250 people at the live event and 450 registrants across, which was pretty significant, I think. And the way we enforced this was, as I mentioned, we had some moderators, we got some volunteers, although in the future we will pay them. And we gave them a script of what to do. So here's the reminding of our conference policy on the left. So essentially everything I described, we said, please say it out loud and then also type it in for anyone who is text-based only. And then we had a script for major violations, for things that were a bit iffy. And then we had a WhatsApp group as well to make sure that if anyone had any sort of questions about what was going on or couldn't kick someone out or whatever came up, we were always in contact with each other. So while that was happening, a lot of us were dropping in and out of each other's meetings to make sure that everything was okay. And it was really, really excellent. It was very streamlined. And the reason that we actually had a script was that our moderators said, like, could I just have this text in front of me, because remembering this is difficult. And so again, the access part of this was the very, very core of every single approach that we took with organizing this conference. So some statistics, we had 400 people originally register in the registration window, with an additional about 13. And then because everything is flipped, we still actually have registration open, and we've registered 34 people this way. So about 450 people have interacted with this media, which is about 400 people more than we expected. And in part because everything went virtual pretty much right when we got funded. There was so much interest in how we were going to do it, which was really, really lucky for us. And the live event saw about 60 to 70 attendees for the main sessions with the speakers, and then up to 20 attendees for any single 20-minute poster slot. So there were a lot of people in all of these Teams meetings. Everyone kind of felt comfortable dropping in and out. I felt based on their time zones, because we were spanning 20 time zones. So I'll talk a bit more about that, about the demographics. So 11 out of the 12 invited speakers were not men. This was only partly intentional. It was mostly because Ellie and I tend to know female scholars. 8 out of the 12 invited speakers were non-white. 10% of the presenters and speakers used non-binary pronouns. So that wasn't a statistic that we came up with, but rather Beck Strauss, who wrote a white paper on non-binary people in astronomy, which I recommend. And we spanned 20 time zones of speakers, but this was super centered on the US, UK, and Western Europe, which was a bit troublesome and something to consider in the future. So these aren't the participants, but these are hits to the SSIC website towards May. So it was we got global interest. We were not as diverse as we would have liked, but this was still really exciting. So a poll of 68 attendees, this statistic makes me very happy. So 24% of them reported being disabled, chronically ill, or neurodivergent. And so in the US and the UK, it ranges between 21 to 25% of people are disabled, but only about 3 to 4% of academics are disabled. So we're reflecting society. And although we weren't fully didn't fully comprise academics, it was still pretty academic heavy. And so we felt like this was a success. Attendees were 64% women, 10% non-binary, and 3% trans. So you could select all that apply, so we don't know the overlap there. Our attendees were also 69% not straight, which I think is really significant. However, most of the attendees who responded were white, with the highest minority being Asian and Asian diaspora. So that's still pretty much reflecting planetary science. And again, something that we have to really think about. And the distribution for the fields, it was about half space sciences and half social sciences and humanities, with a small minority of other natural sciences. And arts are also included in that half with social sciences and humanities. So we really were bridging our two fields, which is exactly what we wanted. The access experiences, 80% of respondents felt we had well supported their needs. I really wish it would have would have been higher, but it's always a lesson to be learned. 75% of attendees reported that emphasis on access had made them more likely to focus on access in the future. So for me, that's really thinking about if we look at our icy moon, of that cold water coming back into the core, right? Of that feedback of the more we have these meetings, the more likely we will have progressive, diverse, and really radical meetings in the future. And 69% of the respondents felt that it had been useful for networking. And that was something that was really, really, really difficult. And I'm sure anyone who's done virtual conferences knows that it's very difficult to do networking. So that is something that we're also reflecting on. And here's some responses that pretty much summarize the other responses that we had about access, allowing for in-depth discussion and that it was more engaging. Being able to absorb the material in my own time and on my own schedule, says this person, was especially valuable as someone who has a busy schedule. And being able to pause and rewind talks allowed me to absorb the ideas. And the second one says, this being the month of Ramadan, I was able to attend a conference while fasting, which would have been impossible in a regular conference format, which is just incredible, I think. My experiences, because it's my talk, it was really, really emotional. Of having these conversations with researchers and activists. You know, how do we make space science more ethical? How do we support activists on the ground who are defending their land? You know, how do we think about art, about space, about how space scientists use art to understand their work? It was just really incredible. We had no comments as questions, which was pretty radical, I think. It was really meaningful discussion that happened, and really welcoming. So I gave one of the invited talks, and you know, I felt comfortable enough to disclose really sensitive things about my experiences in planetary science during the chat that I pretty much never confessed to anyone in a casual setting before, which was really affecting. And again, there were these dynamic conversations and these connections where, you know, scientists were sharing books, historians were sharing books, you know, people were asking for links to these books afterwards. We had a reading list that we circulated afterwards that everyone asked for. You know, just we wanted to learn as much about each other as possible. And that was really great. And it was just rewarding to be able to think about the question, how do we do better, from so many different perspectives. And so in my reflection, I think when we care about what we do and how we do that, regardless of what we're talking about, the lines start to blur between our fields and disciplines. We start thinking a lot more at the bigger scope of how to fix, say, problems in academia. How do we be more responsible scientists when it comes to climate? And it was just really engaging in the network that we built. I'm still hearing about people who attended SSIC who I've never spoken to, who tell me thank you, and we've built collaborations out of this. And yeah, it's been wonderful. And I think coming out of so much pain around conferences was also really rewarding. We also asked, so this conference was free, which we were lucky to offer, but we asked for donations to the Indigenous Environmental Networks COVID-19 Mutual Aid Fund. And we got equivalent to our grant in donations, which was really, really amazing. So some lessons, structure is really, really important, especially because Zoom exhaustion is real. Moderation and chairing are important as part of that structure to help guide conversations and to really make people feel like they're welcome. People still find the conference engaging without live event attendance, and you know, still go back to this as a resource. And I think that's really important when we think about open access and when we think about dissemination of important information and disrupting the hegemony of knowledge. Making sure that people don't have to pay to access something really important, or can access it at a later time in their own time, is really important as well. Social scientists and artists want to work with scientists. Scientists care and are doing really incredible, important equity work, decolonization work, activism, and want to improve their methods and make connections. And that was so clear. I think everyone really approached all of the discussions that we had with an open mind and with a desire to just make the world a better place. And it's also, I think, somewhere we failed was touching base about field-specific jargon, and that's something I would recommend, of finding a way to maybe have a vocabulary list ahead of time, where there was a lot of, I think, social science that fell a bit flat with space scientists. And with Access, we definitely needed live interpreters. Google and Zoom have better captioning than Teams, which is what we used. Combination of text and video were really, really good, and made people more comfortable, regardless of whether they needed the text for access purposes. And being really, really clear and upfront with access measures, and also with moderation, how moderation was going to happen, our code of conduct and our policy, and being open to adjustments, gave people confidence to disclose their needs, to tell us about, I think a lot of people actually told us ahead of time, you know, I used to be afraid of conferences because I would get harassed, that kind of thing. So it was very intimate, the actual meeting. Time zone access wasn't great, and it needed to be more than one day because of it. But we only had so much money. So as I mentioned, and as a little advertisement, although to not my benefit, post-registration is still open, and that's QR code, and that's the URL. You just fill out the contact form, and I'll email you with the password, and nearly all of the content is still there. And you can also read about us. We've done a lot of interviews and podcasts. We've written some papers. We've been cited in other papers, and that's also on our website. So that's the QR code as well. And so thinking about beyond space science and context, because this isn't really a talk only about SSIC. I think meetings are really crucial, but they are failing. They are failing certain communities. They're failing communities that academia is already failing, that society is already failing, and we need to change that. You know, academia will always replicate its own hierarchies in whatever it produces, and it's our job to reimagine beyond that and build something else. So even small measures to bridge these gaps improve diversity, and we see that, and the active involvement of diverse attendees also improves. Access and diversity, again, have to be the core of our icy moon and not just an afterthought, or even the second thought. And interdisciplinary learning and meeting really hinges on the principle of access of, you know, if we're thinking about teaching each other content that we don't have access to. And so I just want us to imagine a dynamic, diverse, accessible future in both space science and just conferencing in general. So that's it. Thank you. And there's some further reading there, and there's my contact information as well.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Divya.
You're welcome.
Does anybody have any questions? You can either pop them in the chat and we'll read them out, or if you just want to unmute and ask your question, that's okay too.
Should I keep the PowerPoint up for the captions, or?
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, sorry. Cool.
I'm actually curious what you're using for captioning. I've been to a few meetings with automated captions, and these ones are better than the ones I've seen.
So yeah, so on Sarah's recommendation, I'm using captioning in PowerPoint. And for some reason, Microsoft has really good captioning in PowerPoint, but not Teams. But yeah, it's really great. So if you just share your screen and you have captions on, you need to have the most up-to-date PowerPoint, I think. Then it just auto captions, which is really great.
I have a question. Hi, Divya. It's so good to see
Hi,
you.
Nicole. You too.
So I'm wondering about accessibility of just in terms of like neurological or like mental, like in terms of having breaks and making sure that people are not experiencing too much fatigue, especially because like, you know, everybody has Zoom fatigue, and you know, having these interactions online are so much more exhausting than having in-person interactions. Do you have any recommendations or any kind of thoughts around that kind of accessibility?
Yeah, I think we struggled with that as well, particularly because we had to cram our event into one day because we only had so much money. So, we weren't paid, we didn't take any money out of the pot to pay us for hosting or anything. We couldn't pay our moderators. So I think a big part is making sure your meeting has enough time to have the space to give people the space that they need, to have longer breaks as well. So I guess like one part of where we suffer with virtual meetings is, for example, like Ableism in academia had a room you could go to, a quiet room, which is good practice for in-person meetings. And virtually, you just don't get that. So I think, cultivating a sort of acceptance in the meeting of please leave if you have to, um, should be really important. I'm not really sure how to like build culture around that. Maybe just reinforcing and saying like, we don't mind if you have to leave in the middle of something. Is good. And then also, yeah, again, just spacing out sessions is really important. I think for us, we made them, I don't know if it was a mistake, we had parallel poster sessions, which I think you experienced, and I found it really overwhelming. And I think it just needed to be spaced out in a linear way where you could drop in and you could drop out and like take some time and have lunch. Like I think even as an attendee, if I had attended everything, I wouldn't have had time to eat lunch actually. So yeah, I think it's really important. It has to be really deliberate planning from the beginning of making sure there's enough time and knowing that everything will overrun. So that time is going to be less than you think it is.
Okay, we have a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is, what recommendations would you make for a hybrid conference in the future when there can be in-person events again?
Yeah, I've been thinking about hybrid conferences because I think the only one I've been to has been Ableism in academia, and I was there in person. I think the important thing is that you have to be prepared to take on both. So hybrid sounds like this nice sort of medium between both, but pretty much is running both in parallel. So I think having enough personnel and also making sure that you have access measures on each side of that, of the hybrid model is really important. So I massively respect anyone who's doing that because I know it's really difficult. But yeah, I think personnel and also making sure from the beginning you understand that each one will have different access needs, for example, or you may need to have 2 interpreters, or you may need to have live captioning from a person and not technology, based on what the conference is.
Speaking of that, the next question in the chat is, do you have any accessibility recommendations for providing deaf or blind access in online conferences?
I have to say I'm not experienced enough to talk about blind accessibility with conferencing, and I think that's also where we failed. With respect, so for us, because everything was flipped, our focus really was on making sure every aspect of our website and of any of the content that we had was screen reader friendly. And so that was kind of where we started with respect to blind accessibility, and also with deaf accessibility with image descriptions as well. But I have to say, like, I will say that I don't know enough to comment, and I wish I did, but I would defer to experts on that.
On that note, our speaker, Sarah, is it in January or February?
I think January.
Our speaker in January is a blind professor who will be speaking on this subject, so stay tuned for
cool.
The announcement for that. The next question in the chat is, in terms of the SSIC format, can you talk about what type of organizations have shown interest? I was so disappointed this year that IAC was not accessible and also completely unresponsive to requests. I'm curious which types of organizations are paying attention versus not.
That's a really good question. Organizations are definitely paying attention, I think, more than we expected. I think we were pretty cynical about it. So I think typically, so small societies have been reaching out and hiring us. So I'm not selling our services here, but so the British Sedimentology Research Group, which already had a really good platform for diversifying geology and sedimentology, which is very non-diverse. essentially said like, we're failing in this and you succeeded a bit, and someone told them about us and they said, you know, can you just like do this for us? Can you write the code of conduct and see where we are slipping with a virtual conference? I would say big societies, it's hard to tell because they're so big, but they seem to be doing some of their homework. I don't know if they're doing enough. I'm trying to be very careful. I think there is a lack of creativity with big conferences where I think they are thinking about, you know, just returning to normal as soon as possible, whereas smaller societies are thinking, okay, this is an opportunity for us to improve and grow, and they have the flexibility to do that, or at least the imagination. So yeah, I would say like, you know, for example, AGU or EPSC here, or EGU had a good format, I think, but I think there wasn't enough like gauging the audience and what they needed of what they thought could work or wouldn't work. I think there's been a lot of, let's try to replicate the normal conference experience as much as possible, which of course isn't great. So that's my very diplomatic answer.
Okay, another question to Divya and anyone else. Do you have example conferences aside from Space and Context that were done well, preferably where I can go to look at materials online, such as the program, code of conduct, etc., for in-person, virtual, or hybrid?
Yeah, there have been so many recently. I should have had a slide on this. There was a conference on conferences called The Future of Meetings, which was held in Australia by Zero. And if you go on, I think they have an app running where you can just go through and all the talks are hosted on separate pages. They have their captions. I think speakers could upload their own transcripts. And so the conference actually ran in September, and you could go on and have a live chat that was text-based. But I think everything is still there. So that's a really good resource if you're interested in conferences and conferences about conferences. That was a good example. I've also heard, I think there have been some good ones in computing. I don't know them off the top of my head, so I would defer to other people. And then there was also CogX, which I've never attended, but I consulted for, which was pretty much they live streamed most of their content on YouTube, and had different ways of connecting people. I don't know how they did on the access side, but they did a really good job on adapting to virtual. So I don't know if anyone else has answers.
There are a few that have been posted in the chat, but if anybody wants to unmute and talk about conferences that they might have attended that they really liked, feel free.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to jump in. Divya, thank you so much. Like, so much of everything you said resonated on every level. I am someone who is I have partial hearing in one ear, and I really rely on Otter AI as a plugin for many of the conference calls I have, and I have to declare that I'm using it. Number one, because of the sensitive nature of the work that I do. Equally, I have to use a VPN because of the sensitive nature of the work that I do. And I actually worked on CogX, so I was really happy for you to mention that. I also was one of the hosts for some of the stages this year and also in previous years. So it's really great feedback to hear that it's one of the good ones. And I think many of the tech conferences I go to, like, I think it is so important, and this is only something I learned by having burnt out, was actually leaving a room if I wasn't absorbing information. And I just think, unless someone tells you that, or unless someone reminds you of that and you have a really good host or moderator, it's really easy just to stay in a room because everybody else is. And I've just learned that if my energy isn't absorbing the conference material, I'll just get up and go. And often some of the best conversations I've had have been at the coffee stand when I've been going to get energy or fresh air. So that's all I wanted to say. I just want to say thank you so much. And I really appreciated everything you had to say. And I can't wait to catch up on your content.
Can I add something more as a comment about what hasn't worked? So I know that you were talking about that you really need to run parallel conferences in the hybrid mode. I do I totally agree about the imagination required to do some of these things. But one of the things that is an issue when people have tried to, when I've asked for access to something, to an event or something, and they've tried to be like, okay, we'll give you a hybrid option, is that they're not thinking about the participation from the entire room. And so, for example, the speaker who might be close to a microphone, I can hear them, but not the rest of the discussion. And so that so you really do have to plan that kind of ahead of time. Whether enforcing microphones and stuff like, or having actually having microphones for people. So if you're doing a live stream, even if it's like a closed live stream in this case, people can actually hear you. And the other one I wanted to mention, which was a good one, which is not a technical conference, it's actually it's an expo for abilities. It's called an Ability Expo. I went last year, and they actually had live captioning even for in person, and that's something that I hadn't seen before, and it was amazing because I could actually follow the presentation. They had a side-by-side screen of the presentation as well as the live captioning, and that was really neat in an in-person conference as well.
That's amazing. Yeah, thank you. I think Ableism in Academia had the live captioning. That was the only time I've ever seen it. They had that split screen, but yeah, that's a really good idea.
We've got time for maybe one more question if anybody has any burning questions left. Okay, well, thank you again, Divya, so much for that presentation. This is a lot of fantastic information for all of us to take into account in planning conferences or giving feedback to conferences that we will be attending in the future to make sure that we can do what we can to make the community better and convey this information in a better way.